what really tells scientists that we are related to other organisms are these weird mistakes we have in common with other organisms. These mistakes don't make sense in light of any other paradigm than that of descent with modification from a common ancestor. One of these mistakes is what I study in the lab. They're called endogenous retroviruses. And I contend that if Darwin was never born, or if he was born and he decided to open a salon in day spa in Cuba or something, and every fossil remained buried, if we managed to figure out how to sequence DNA, the second that we could compare genomes to one another, and we saw the way these endogenous retrovirus patterns set up in all the organisms, then descent with modification would have smacked us over the head like a pillowcase full of doorknobs. So what am I talking about when I say endogenous retroviruses? Well, everybody has heard of retroviruses, of course, like HIV. Unlike humans, which we carry our genetic information as DNA, which gets turned into a message, RNA, that gets turned into protein, retroviruses do things a little different. They go from a genome that's RNA, and then they turn it into DNA, and they sneak that into our genome. And so what happens is this virus becomes a permanent staple of that cell's genome. And it tricks it into thinking, oh yeah, this is a normal cellular protein. I'm supposed to be making this. Yeah, everything's fine. And they end up making all of these viruses that go on to infect more cells and wreak the havoc that we know of. Now, endogenous retroviruses, they're a mistake. It's what happens when a retrovirus infects a cell that it's not supposed to infect, like a sperm or an egg. Normally, they want to infect your immune cells or epithelial cells or something like that. But when they infect one of these sperm or egg, if they go on to participate in fertilization and that embryo doesn't die from the genetic mayhem that virus causes, then what happens is that permanent resident in that embryo's genome, that permanent retrovirus, gets passed on like any other gene, just like the PAX6 gene, just like the gene that says, what color that embryo's hair will be. It's absolutely normal. So, when we look at the human genome, and we look for endogenous retroviruses, we see that some of them are unique to humans. We can't find them in other species. But some of them we have in common with other primates, with chimps, with gorillas, orangutans, with gibbons, with other old world monkeys, going all the way back to New World monkeys. But these aren't just static landmarks that scientists stated, oh yeah, evolution happened because of these guys. These endogenous retroviruses, it's a very unlikely event that one of these events happens, that a retrovirus infects a sperm or an egg, it goes on to be an embryo, that goes on to be a normal organism. But when we're talking about millions and millions and millions of years, random unlikely events happen a lot, to the point where about 8.5% of your genome are these endogenous retroviruses. You're 8.5% viral, which I think is cool. And so you've got tens of thousands of these retroviral genes in your genome. On the bright side, most of these are non-functional. They've accumulated mutations, they've accumulated deletions and frame shifts. They don't work anymore. That's really good. But unfortunately, there's a few dozen that can still code for a protein. Now, your cells still have ways of keeping these guys quiet, but sometimes that doesn't work out. And what we found is that in basically every cancer we look at, we can find these endogenous retroviral particles coming out. So when you've got these retroviruses coming out, popping in, coming out, popping in, causing a lot of genomic instability, which leads to cancer. At this point, we don't know whether it's a cause of cancer or whether it's an effect that perpetuates cancer, but we need to understand these endogenous retroviruses and their place in evolution to just figure out what's going on so we can hopefully figure out a cure for these diseases. And it's not just cancer. They're associated with multiple sclerosis and lupus. and a lot of other diseases. So to scientists, this isn't just an abstract thing that, oh, we're just obsessed with a paradigm and we can't look at things any other way. It's really important to us. Unfortunately, the creationist response I've had to endogenous retroviruses is baffling. The Institute for Creation Research just says that endogenous retroviruses don't exist. When they speak about endogenous retroviruses, they say supposed or so-called or whatever. They're not real. Intelligent design creationists think that scientists are making them up. Like, we're looking at this DNA code and like a beautiful mind, we start seeing all these patterns coming up of viruses. No. Viruses, I think a lot of the general public think are like these alien, kind of foreign creatures. They're actually a very diverse species, families. So HIV is as related to the youngest retrovirus in your genome as we're related to green algae. So there's a lot of diversity in retroviruses. So when we say there's a retrovirus there, we know what we're talking about. Sometimes they say that retroviral insertion is at random. And that's absolutely a valid question, because we know that humans and chimpanzees can be infected by the same retroviruses. That's how we got HIV. But again, they're forgetting the diversity of retroviruses and the randomness of where they insert in genomes. Just recently, we found a very unlikely retrovirus in lemurs, a whole different species of lemurs. And so scientists thought, well, maybe this retrovirus inserted in a common ancestor of lemurs like 85 million years ago. And that didn't seem quite right to them, but it's a possibility. And they also thought it was a possibility that this retrovirus independently inserted in several species of lemur. So they didn't just guess or throw up their arms and say, whatever, it's the older one. They looked at those sequences and determined that they were actually very different retroviruses, and that these were two independent events. So we know when things are random, and whether it's common descent that is the more likely explanation, or independent insertion sites. Sometimes they say ERVs don't work because not every organism has them. That's true. Plants don't have endogenous retroviruses, but they have things that are very, very similar. And so we can work back phylogenetic trees of plants using those weird mistakes. Because ERVs, they aren't the whole picture, they're just a part of the picture. And ERVs paint a big portion of it. And worst of all, some say that 8.5% of your genome that's retroviral, it's not really a mistake, they're all functional. And where they get this idea is that it's very, very cool. But we have mammals because an endogenous retroviral protein was domesticated by your genome. So this retrovirus inserted, and instead of just having it delete itself into nothing, your cell was like, hey, this is useful for something. And so all mammals actually use an endogenous retroviral protein to create a placenta. We exist because of a viral protein. I think that's awesome. The problem is, creationists take that to the extreme and say, well, because this one is functional, they all must be functional. They're not all functional. We know what happens when you're infected with one functional retrovirus, AIDS. And so you don't want 8.5% of your genome making all these viruses. You get cancer, you get all sorts of diseases. It's a good thing these guys are junk. So why do I care personally about evolution in classrooms and that sort of thing for kids? Well, because I'm very confident in the education I'm getting here in Oklahoma. I love it. But I'm not vain enough to think that I'm going to cure AIDS and cancer personally. So I'd really like to use my career to advance scientific knowledge in my field, and then have kids come up after me to be graduate students when I'm a principal investigator, to take over the labs when I want to retire someday. So that's why I care, and this is how we use evolution.